Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome along to the final session of the Edinburgh International TV Festival. I'm Edith Bowman. I'm very honoured and happy to be here today and to chat to the gentleman who will be joining us in just one second. So today's session, music and storytelling. It's a fascinating relationship, but how does it work and what is that relationship? Can it be one that is taken for granted? Can the power of a good score or a tune blow your mind, blow your imagination? Or can it be a device to add forced jeopardy, tension, or emotion? Well, we have a man with us this afternoon who hopefully can answer a lot of those questions. Now, if you would like to ask any questions today, what we'd really like to do is try and incorporate into the session rather than do that thing of having a chat here and then get your questions at the end. So if you have any questions that you would like to ask David, then please get involved on Twitter using the hashtag EdTVFest. So it is a huge honour and privilege to welcome a man to the stage who works incredibly successful across both TV and film, and last year was given the small role of musical director of the London Olympics and Paralympic Games. Please welcome Mr. David Arnold. What?
So I had my money on 55 and there might be 60.
Before we get into the whole kind of TV and film, music side of things as well is incredible because, you know, an insight into your collaborative work is impressive and varied. Everybody from Iggy Pop, Jarvis Cocker, Amy Mann to left field, and of course Dame Shirley Bassey, which got me thinking about, you know, the idea that each one of those must be for you a completely unique experience.
I think whenever you're dealing with any artist, it's you have to look at it as a unique experience because everyone has. I mean, I think remember as a sort of record producer, it's like you have to remember that it's not your record and it's their record. But I think there's inevitably some part of you that ends up being on the record because presumably that's why they've asked you to do it. But I always thought I'd be a lousy teacher because I never really have any patience. You know, I've got very little patience for people who can't do things immediately. And most of these people are absolutely brilliant and can be brilliant at the drop of a hat. So it ends up being a real pleasure to do it. And for me, it's interesting as well because film is an incredibly isolating experience. Film is a place where you kind of lock yourself away for months on end, and you emerge at the end, you know, blinking into the lights, and if you're lucky, you get invited to your own premiere, and if you're lucky, you're not asked to get off the red carpet because you're standing in front of someone from Hollyoaks. But normally that is what happens.
Well, let's just remind ourselves of a small, compact and bijou example of some of your work. Wow. Got to be happy with that.
Some of those things have been on telly, so I don't mind being here.
What inspired a young man from Luton to want to become a composer?
I saw my first sort of little batch of films when I was about 7 or 8 years old, which was the Jungle Book, Oliver, and You Only Live Twice, all very close to each other. And each of those films were amazing visually and amazing cast, but also incredible songs in all of them. Obviously, 2 of them are musicals, but also the Bond thing. You know, you've got the Bond theme, and you've got John's song for You Only Live Twice, and the great instrumental score in that, and all those things. I sort of felt like I wanted to be a part of the thing that I was feeling when I was watching it. I think that happens a lot. You know, I mean, it happens to me when I'm watching a stand-up comedy show. It's like I want to do that as well. It's like when you see anything brilliant, you kind of want to be a part of it, don't you? Well, I do. And so I thought that's kind of what I wanted to do. I mean, it took another, you know, sort of 25 years before anyone would pay me to do it. But in that time, you know, watched an awful lot of films, wrote an awful lot of music, and tried to understand the reasons why things happen with music and with picture, you know, and to try and explore the relationship between those two things and why when you do certain things with music it makes you perceive something in a completely different way. So I suppose it's the drama and the storytelling aspect of it, I think, which is the most important part.
How do you think music can tell a story?
I think you need to have an inherent understanding about how story works. I'm not saying that I necessarily do that well, but I feel that I can understand why I can, you tie all these different knots of drama together. And whereas I think, a music college can certainly teach the basics of music composition, but I think there's just something that you have to inherently understand about what a story needs and why it needs it. And I'm not sure how you can actually teach that. It's almost an instinctive thing. But I think everyone feels that when you're in the audience. And for me, it's just a matter of recognizing that emotion. I'm thinking, like, what am I missing here? Or what do we feel that we need to do? And I always kind of approach it from an audience perspective. So I kind of disassociate myself from it in a sort of professional sense and think about, if I'm sitting here watching this, how do I feel? And a lot of the time, I think you have to have a take on it, and you have to have a stand on it, and you have to say, this is what I think it should be. Because I'm not sure that people would want to employ you and then get a composer who says, what do you want me to do? How do you want me to do it?
Growing up, when you were watching, those films and also TV that stuck with you, the music and stuff, was it a case of there were people that impressed you that you thought did it best?
Well, certainly John Barry was someone who seemed to be ubiquitous around British film, and then, of course, international film at the time. And I think, especially with the Bond movies, they were something that were on in your house at sort of social times. Before DVD and VHS, and the idea that you could watch a movie on the TV that was less than 6 or 7 years old, it was unheard of. So you'd go and see a film at a cinema, and it would run for sort of 8 weeks, and that would be the only choice that you had. And then 8 or 9 years later, it would be on the TV, and it would be a big deal that it was on the TV. And these films were always on TV at sort of very sort of sociable family times, like Bond film. Bond film was always on at Christmas, or it was always on at Easter. So it was a kind of communal family thing. And there's a sort of sense of intimacy that it creates, that television creates, that you don't get in film. I found that that's a very interesting thing that I've noticed, because, I've done, I suppose, relatively few things on television. I've been lucky to do things that I think have been good, and people seem to have liked them when they've happened. And I've probably had more attention for things like Little Britain and Sherlock than I have for the films. And I think that's because there's an intimacy that's created when you appear in someone's house, not personally, but when your music's playing or a show's on, and it's it's in their space, and I think that's why people feel that they can say hello to people that are on the telly more than they can from films, because you're right there, you're 3 feet away from me and the dog and me mum and dad, so the storytelling aspect, I think, is being aware very much of perhaps what an audience is receiving, emotionally more than anything.
Do you think that music's underestimated and taken for granted when it comes to productions, whether that be TV or feature?
It's usually under-budgeted. More often than not, like, the first thing that I get asked if I'm asked to do TV stuff is, we haven't got any money, or we don't have enough money, or we've got very little money, or there's an expectation that music will be created on a home computer, at a home studio, which for certain programs I think is absolutely appropriate, but I think to assume that it's going to work across the board. And there are great pieces of TV music obviously still being written and recorded with real players, and certainly I know the composers would prefer to be able to use real players, but that costs money, and more often than not, at the end of a production, most of that's gone. So but composers tend to do it anyway. I think obviously they love doing it, and but I would have not have wanted to do Sherlock, we were right, with Michael Price. Neither of us wanted to do it in the box. We didn't want to do it with computers. And so we have this kind of hybrid sort of electronic and acoustic. So we use real players. But it's still a bit of it's a squeeze. It's not a luxury. Well, it is a luxury, but we don't have the luxury of doing lots of time. When you're recording the scores for these things, there's usually about 70 minutes of music in an episode of Sherlock, and you record everything in 1 3-hour session. So you don't really have time to sort of finesse, or, you know, in a way it's bad because the director hasn't got time to, you know, perhaps could we try it this way or that way. So it's, you know, you do tend to have to like, end up with what you know, your first instinct, your initial instinct. Films is slightly different because it's over a sort of 2 or 3 month period, and there's a lot of toing and froing in terms of shaping the music and what it could be. Not that there isn't in TV, but it's more because of the time pressure and because of the budget pressure. There isn't really that much time to do anything other than hopefully what your first instinct and your first demo says.
I imagine that it's different, a different process as well for TV and film. But in terms of, you know, when you're brought into a project, how do you like to work? In an ideal scenario, when are you brought into a project? When are you brought on board? And
for TV specifically,
yeah.
do you think? Most of the, well, I think all of the TV things I've done have been with friends. I've been asked because I've been friends with people that have done it, and that's just been the way it was right from the beginning. With like that Free Agents thing was done through Naira Park because I knew Edgar and Simon, Edgar Wright and Simon Pegg, and so I'd met them, and they were making that show, so they asked me, and then I've known Matt and David for like 2 years before they made Little Britain. I'd got to know them, and they were doing a radio show, the pilot of Little Britain, and I read a script, and I said, it was really funny, can I write the theme tune for you? And they said, yeah. I haven't got any money because it was just a radio pilot. So I did that for the radio pilot, and then we went on and made the radio series, and then they piloted the first episode on BBC Three, and then they went to series. But the music effectively didn't really change from day one, and that was because I knew David and Matt. And then Mark Gatiss, who I knew then via David, came to me with Sherlock, and so, you know, I haven't sort of been commissioned probably in the normal way that most people are in terms of doing shows. It's always sort of been through friends, and because of that, I've always sort of had quite a long run into it. So I've known with Little Britain, it was very under the radar, and nothing was really known about it because it wasn't even a show. It was it was an idea that they had at that point. With Sherlock, they had a pilot that I think they tried a couple of ideas on with music, and they wanted to change that. But again, there was no real kind of rush to get it done because they didn't have transmission. It was only a pilot at that point, and so I had a bit of a run into that as well.
Yeah.
So those are kind of quite luxurious situations. There are other, like with Big School as well, which was one of those things that actually changed it at the last minute. It was something completely different up until 2 weeks before transmission.
Wow.
Because I made the mistake at that point, and it's sort of embarrassing to still be making mistakes like that at this point. But I read the scripts of Big School. I went to the set. I met with everyone, and this is before I'd seen a frame of footage. And I thought, I had an idea for what it could be, which kind of sat with the idea of what the show was. Mm-hmm. So I said, like, what about if we write a kind of like a school song, the sort of thing you used to have to sing in assembly when you had assembly. We write a school song and we have it sung by really bored teenagers. So it's like everyone just sounds really pissed off and doesn't want to be there, and with a sort of not very good school orchestra, which sounded like a sort of funny kind of idea. And we did the entire thing, and put it up against it with the director and the producer, and we're going like, yeah, this is good. But there was something sort of slightly off about it, and I'm not quite sure what it was. And I watched the cut of the first episode, and I think we all realised that actually what the show is about, if it needs any subtext at all, was there was something quite nostalgic for the sort of simplicity and the idiocy of school life, and also this sort of kind of on-off will they won't they thing with Catherine Tate and David. So I thought, so we said, like, it's not really working. So in about 10 minutes then we went back and redid this song, which I think sat really nicely with it, which is a kind of wistful, kind of nostalgic, kind of strum along kind of thing for the titles, which is completely different to the sort of formality of it. And so within, you know, that decision meant that it went from being a formal, literal, I suppose slightly tedious idea, obvious idea, to something which felt like it was telling you something beyond what the show was. So ideally, you'd like to have time to try different things and come up with stuff, but I think it's a mistake to do it before you see the show, because I've done plenty of films where I've seen the script and kind of you sign up on the idea of this script is great. No one's made a brilliant film out of a lousy script, so I mean, if it's a lousy script, you just wouldn't, you know, you probably wouldn't do it anyway. But it is very easy to make a poor film, you know, or a not so great film out of a good script or a great script. A lot of things can happen, you know, between the page and actually getting it on the stage. So, you know, ideally you wait until you can see it, and then you have a real idea about what the film is.
How often have you said no?
Quite a lot, yeah, quite a lot. I tend to say yes to things that A, I think I can do well, and B, are they people that I'm going to like working with? And am I people that I'm going to want to go the extra mile for? Because, you know, I've had the odd experience with some, you know, sort of quite bullyish kind of people. And it's not as if you can't handle them, but it's just a little bit unpleasant. And if you're writing 16, 17 hours a day, 7 days a week, pretty exclusively, devoting 3 months of your life to this project, sometimes more, you're going to want to like the people that you're doing it with, and you're going to want to enjoy it, you know. And it's like, if you're not enjoying it, it shows in lots of ways. So I tend to do it based on, do I think it's going to be any good? I mean, I got sent a film once. It was called The Sixth Day, and when I got the script, it was by the director of Tomorrow Never Dies, Roger Spottiswoode. When I got the script, it was Harrison Ford was attached to it. And it was a film, I don't know if anyone saw it, but it was about cloning. And it was quite a simple idea, but it seemed like quite a brilliant idea at the time, which was Harrison Ford, as he was, comes home. He's about to go in his front door, and he looks in his front room, and he sees himself playing with his family. This is some kind of dystopian, futuristic scenario that, you know, that where cloning happens, and through some kind of industrial accident or something, they'd accidentally cloned Harrison Ford. Now, if you clone someone in this film, in this script, he would be exactly the same as you. He'd have the same memories, the same experience. So it would effectively be you. So which one is the real person? Now, with Harrison Ford in that role, that sounds like a real, you know, like torturous kind of, who am I? You know, who are you essentially as a human being? You know, it's like a philosophical question, I suppose, like the same thing with the boat. You know, if you gradually replace all the parts of a boat with new parts, is it the same boat at the end, you know, after 10 years of doing it? And so I suppose it's the same with human beings. But he dropped out, and then Arnold Schwarzenegger came back.
Ooh,
now that's without changing a word that's on the page, it's immediately a different film. I'm not saying it's better or worse, but then it's something which we kind of know what that film's going to be like. And so, you know, casting makes so basically the bottom line is casting can make a big difference. You know, just to have one actor go out and someone else come in, all of a sudden it's a very, very different piece of work. So hopefully wait until you see, for me now, wait until you see what it is, and then look at it, and then hopefully have a week or so away from looking at it and start thinking about perhaps what it could feel like musically.
When you have that you know, you're talking about big school and being given, you know, major change quite late in the day sort of thing, you know, that's a completely alien idea to me in terms of, you know, a musician should be given that kind of creative freedom and time to come up with something, however long it takes them to come up with it. But to be able to deliver something, you know, within, you've got to do this, redo it in 2 weeks and stuff. That must be quite a hard thing you almost must get yourself into a routine of being able to do that.
Well, I think that's one of the things that puts a lot of people who work in contemporary music or pop music off, you know, because in contemporary music, a record is done when you say it's done as the artist. In film or TV, it's done where 30 other people who some of you never meet say it's done. But part of the thing, I probably wouldn't do anything if I didn't have a deadline. You know, it's unlikely that I would get a single thing done if I didn't have a deadline. So when someone says, I need something by tomorrow, I could probably do it by tomorrow. If someone says, we need something in 6 months' time, it would take me 6 months to do it. I've got no idea why that is. But for me, it's always, I'm choosing something which means that there's something in front of me that says, this is what I need. So even though it's like you're working with a blank page every time, there's still like a bit like Lawrence Llewellyn-Bowen and his MDF. He goes into a house that already exists, and they say, "Can you make it a bit more like that?"
Okay.
So it's like this thing exists. That was probably a pretty poor metaphor, but it's like this thing exists, but it needs something else, and so it's just trying to read into it what it is.
And how collaboratively do you like to work with directors and producers, or do you kind of like to be left? Do you obviously like a brief, or how collaboratively do you like to work?
Well, I think the real successes always come when everyone's happy, and some directors are very happy to leave you alone and come back at the end of 2 or 3 weeks and say, "Just play me what you've got." Other directors are much more on it. I mean, Edgar on Hot Fuzz, Edgar's a bit like an animator. He's like frame by frame, everything is analysed, and not only was he there an awful lot while we were writing it, but in the recording of it, he was there and saying, "How about if we change that?" Or he has an idea, and every step of the way, he's thinking of ways of trying to make it funnier and make it better. And generally, it was. Even in the mix, it's like we'd be changing things and coming back. We were mixing music, and directors never turn up to music mixes, getting sounds right on bass drums and things like that. But he was there every sort of step of the way, trying to find ways of making it funnier and better. Martin Campbell, for instance, on Casino Royale, I would just send him demos every couple of weeks, and we'd have a meeting once every 3 or 4 weeks and go through what he felt was either missing or we needed to change. So everyone's different, and part of the thing about being I suppose a media composer is the juggling of the personalities, because the work aspect of it, there's probably hundreds of thousands of people who can do this job better than I can. Part of the thing, I think, is getting on well with people and being able to understand and deal with sometimes sort of tricky personalities. But I think, again, if you try and choose nice people and work with people who are sort of nice to you, and you therefore makes it easier to be nice back.
And you'll go back and work with them again. And
Bond, I would hope so. Yeah.
Bond is a great example of that. So we're going to take. Bond's been a big part of your life and your career.
Yeah, I've done 5 of them, and the first one was in 1997. So yeah, I mean, it's weird because like people, there's someone came up to me like 23, 24, and he goes, "I watched my first Bond movie, your one, when I was a kid." And I'm thinking, like, that's not right.
Well, let's
that's
remind
like
us.
Children, and now they're adults. And it only seems like, it's weird though, because it does only really seem like yesterday that I did it. It really doesn't feel like it was 17 years
That's
ago.
a good sign. That's a good sign. We're going to remind ourselves of just one of those Bond films that you worked on, Casino Royale.
Might have been the trailer.
It was.
That might not have been a clip.
We had to for clearance reasons.
Oh, yeah.
I just want to watch it now. But I mean, from all those Bonds that you've worked on, have you got a favourite moment, a favourite piece, a favourite scene that you?
I have like bits from each one. I really like the remote control BMW Pierce
in the
Brosnan.
back of the car, yeah.
Back of the car, Pierce Brosnan. I really like that. It was shot at Brent Cross.
Are you there for a lot of the filming then as well?
No, I usually spend a couple of days on set just to try and get an understanding of the sort of tone of it, and to meet the director, and generally just to sort of soak it up. I suppose Bonds are a bit of an unusual thing because to a certain extent the blueprint is already set. It was the same when I did Shaft. It's like you don't want to go too far from what people expect, but you need to go far enough so it doesn't stagnate. So I like that bit. I like the boat chase at the start of The World Is Not Enough. When he's got that little Q speedboat, ends up in front of the dome.
This is just the Bond geek in you coming out now, just all your favourite bits. With this type of project, though, I imagine, I don't know, budgets differ from project to production to production.
Yeah.
And is it always bigger for film than it is for TV?
It tends to be bigger for film, mainly because the requirement, I suppose, for film overall is so much larger, because you've got to, you've got your P&A stuff, and you've got to be ferrying all your stars around the world for promotion. You've got to physically make prints, or now like with digital projection, that's less of an issue. But in terms of the advertising spend, it's so enormous.
What about in terms of you, in terms of what you get budget-wise?
It tends to be much more in film. Yeah, I mean the overall requirements tend, but with that come a certain other sort of sets of responsibilities, and usually that accounts for the amount of people that tend to get involved. as your budget starts heading north, more and more people will have something to say about what it is that you're doing, and will need to be heard and paid attention to. I had done a film for a big Hollywood studio where the director and the producers were very much at opposite ends of what was needed for the film, and the producers were phoning me up and going like, whatever you do, don't do what the director's saying. The director says, whatever you do, don't do what the producers are saying. So I try to do what most like musicians try to do and make everyone happy, which is the worst thing that you can do. So I did this kind of hybrid thing, and I played it to the director, who said the most brilliant thing I've ever heard when criticising a piece of music, which was, that sounds like 17 other films, none of which I want to see.
Oh.
But you don't mind.
How'd you come back from that?
Well, because it's like, that wasn't my idea, you know. It was like, that was trying to keep that idiot away from that idiot and that idiot and that idiot. They're not idiots, obviously, but...
prove them wrong with your creativity, then, basically.
Well, you know, it's difficult because everyone's got a different idea. And when they're spending 50, 60, 70, 80 million dollars, then, you know, there is an awful lot at stake. And so you just have to get used to... I mean, do you know what? You never have a problem if you do a good job. Basically, you know, the bottom end. I mean, if people can find a problem with it that is indefensible, then you know that there's probably something wrong with the material. You know, the thing with the big school idea was that if I honestly disagreed with the idea that it wasn't working, then I would have said so. But the fact is, it's one of those instances where you think there's something quite off about it, I'm not quite sure what it is, and everyone sees it then, you know, and then you go, okay, you're right, let's have another go.
I imagine as well that each project's different in the fact that you'll have projects where the director will ultimately call the shot, but then you'll have a relationship with other people where they'll trust you and they'll go, do you know what, you're right. Yeah. This works better.
Yeah. Well, I think if you've got a smart director, you know, I mean, the other thing about trying to be articulate about what you're doing, and the problem with music is that it gets to a point when there's pointless talking about it anymore. The only way you can really make anyone understand what it is you're trying to do is to do it and play it to them. And so most of the time, if you've got a sort of smart director, but what really interested me about directors with TV is that a lot of the time it's the producers that have the final say. You know, they're much more the sort of powerful individual in that setup. And directors obviously hugely important, but it's usually I found that it's usually the producers who tend to be the ones sort of calling the shots alongside directors.
We're going to move on to TV in a second. Just a quick question from Lynn, who says, what advice or tips would you give a young composer trying to break into the business? Thank you.
Well, I can only really speak from my experience, which was I met someone when I was 19 and he was 16, and he wanted to be a film director and I wanted to be a film composer. So we started working together, and then I met other people who, like at art colleges and at film colleges, and there's quite a few sort of film units in art colleges around the country, and there's a National Film and Television School where there are departments where they are starting to make films or experimental films. And I think the best thing that you could do is, the most realistic thing you could do, or let's put it this way, the most unrealistic thing you could do is to send a DVD or a CD to a Hollywood film studio and expect to be hired. You know, that you will be on the back of a very, very long queue, 8-9 miles long, full of people all who are in the same position. If you have someone that you've worked with for 4 or 5 years, starting from scratch, who eventually gets to the point where they might make a film, they're probably more likely to bring you with them than to then all of a sudden hire a stranger. So I think establish relationships with people who are in the same position as you are. You know, I wouldn't. It's probably a waste of time trying to find someone at a TV place who's going to give you a break, because why would they above anyone else? So I think do as much and get as much experience like actually writing to picture. So by the time it gets to, because I didn't have a formal musical education in terms of composition, but when it came to like going to a film, it's like, well, I haven't got a music degree, but I've got 23 short films. And that's really all they're interested in, your ability to do the job that they're hiring you to do.
Okay. As well as drama and comedy for TV, you also, as I mentioned earlier, worked on probably the biggest world stage for a live event. Here's a minute and a half of what I'd imagine was a lot of work. Wow, a minute and a half of a job, a musical director, which involved, I imagine, quite a lot of work.
Yeah, it was. I was kind of around it for about 3 years and on it for like 1.5 years solid. and I think we recorded like 25 different artists and rearranged like all of those songs. And again, that was a thing that was constantly in flux as well. You know, the scariest thing about closing ceremony was that we couldn't rehearse in the stadium ever. So we'd never run the show in the stadium. We were rehearsing over at the Dagenham Ford car plant in Dagenham, and everyone was going like, don't say who it is, don't tell who any of the artists are. It's all top secret. And so we turned up for a first day rehearsal with that, and like all along, it's by a motorway, you know, and there's a big sign outside going like, you know, Dagenham Ford welcomes the Olympics, closing ceremony rehearsal team. So there's all these pats standing on, you know, so that's where all the photographs came from. But so that was, it was quite scary because I knew that there was going to be, the audience was like 1 billion. And I was travelling down on the train with the drive with all the music on in a bag over my shoulder on the morning of the ceremony. So we'd been rehearsing at Dagenham, but that wouldn't allow us to be in the stadium. So we got to the stadium and we realised that the top half of the set wouldn't fit in because of the way that the wiring for the flying stuff had come in. And some things didn't work. You know the bus that turned into the giant octopus that Norman was in? That had never worked. That had never folded back up again and gone back in. The Millennium Wheel that turned on its side and lifted up, that had never happened because we'd never had the flying rig at Dagenham to make it happen. So for the first 20 minutes of that show, I know that if that wheel hadn't have gone down and up, because most of the show then ended up going above and across. You know, George Michael comes out of the, you know, Roger Taylor comes out, Jessie J comes across it. Everyone's coming in and out of this sort of central unit. And I thought, if that doesn't lift up, you know, we're stuck. And it was live to 1 billion people. So. And there is a guy as well whose job whose job I'm glad I didn't have, was to cue the different music. I mean, there were about 140 channels of music for different sort of international requirements. I think the Middle East broadcast, we mixed all the music with all the vocals hard right and hard left because they do a lot of talking and they always talk on the centre channel. So all you'd hear if you were listening to any one of those people singing, Kate Bush or Annie Lennox, you would have heard like Arabic conversation over the top of it. So it's knowing little things like that. But it did mean that there were an awful lot of different things happening. And some bloke had to sit there and basically press the button which went go, you know. And all of those different things were cued individually. The different, you know, different pieces of music, different segments.
Where were you?
Well, I started off in the control room, but I realised that there's very little I could do. The show went live at 8 o'clock. At 3 minutes to 8, I was going to go and sit somewhere. I had to buy my own ticket. I did. And 3 minutes later, I got a phone call. We think all the take that backing vocals are all out of sync. At 3 minutes too, you know. So it never ended. It was like that right up until the point where the show went off. But then I think we just got very, very lucky. We got very lucky. And the fact that it was beautiful weather on the night. And it's the same with Paralympics, you know. It's like we'd rehearsed both of those ceremonies in the pouring rain pretty much 100% of the time. Yeah. So we'd never known what it was like without rain. And it was much nicer.
When you're composing that, when you're putting everything together, it's a live event, but are you also conscious that it's also a TV event?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in a way, you're curating this thing. I mean, it ended up being quite a bit less composition than I thought it was going to be. Mm. There was still about 10 or 15 minutes of original music, 20 minutes original music in closing, and then Paralympics was a lot more. It was like 25 to 30. Because, I mean, the Paralympics thing was like a one-artist event, so it was much easier. But yeah, you're aware that it's a TV event. You try to be aware that it's going out all over the world, but at the same time, I think, you know, it's like, it is our event, you know, and I remember like Australia being unashamedly Australian in the approach that they took to their events, and I thought, well, you know, we should be British, you know. I mean, it should be everything that you kind of would want it to be, and some it for us, you know. And Danny was doing exactly the same thing in opening, you know. And it's like, well, actually, this is for us, even though it is for everyone, and you're aware that it's everyone. But you know, I mean, we've got like international music people, so you know that the appeal is going to be wide and far. So you know, I mean, closing was a much broader thing. It doesn't have the same responsibility as opening, because opening is really saying something about the country as a whole, whereas the whole point of closing is to sort of say thank you to everyone and to sort of send everything off with a big bang.
Would you do it again?
Well, they were talking about the idea of doing stuff in Rio and actually the Russian one. But I think the thing that really I loved about doing the one over here was that it was, you know, when it's where you live, you know, it's like sort of 6 or 7 miles from your house. This thing is happening, and the whole place feels like it's sort of coming alive. It's not my job to be musical director of Olympic Games. It was then, but if I did it again, then it would be my job, and I don't want it to be my job. You know, my job is like film, TV, and theatre and things, making records, and then it would be a job. You know, and I never want it to feel like it's something which I feel somewhat obliged to do, and I thought, well, I'm not going to know anything. I don't know about Brazilian music better than someone in Brazil who's going to be able to do it. But there's something to be said for having people that have done it before, because we're doing a film for Brazil about how we handled what we did in order to try and give them a bit of our experience, and I think it will help a lot, because I mean it's extraordinary the amount of things that you have to do.
Step
Not
by
only that,
step
but the rule books from the IOC is like that thick. The things that you can and can't do.
Wow.
And things you have to do with like the anthems and the way that you play them and where they come in the ceremony.
Yeah.
So a lot of certain things have to happen. So yeah, no, it was great.
Talking of anthems, this is one that a few of you might recognise. Little Britain, which you touched on earlier. I'm sorry we're having to rush through. It's just you've got so much to talk about in your repertoire. But what brief were you given? Because you mentioned earlier about the fact that it was for the radio show.
Well, I didn't have a brief. It was. I mean, I thought, reading the script and talking to Matt and Dave, that actually what we needed to write, or what it needed, was like a national anthem for the people that live in that version of Britain. So normally you'd have God Save the Queen. But I thought, let's do something which feels like it could be an anthem for the country that those people live in. So I wrote it like in a very sort of formal, sort of slightly William Walton-y sort of, very British way, orchestral. And then I deliberately had it played by too few people. So it sounded like it was trying a bit too hard, So there's an air of desperation in the performance as well. I don't know if that comes across really, but it's almost like if you could play it at night, last night at the Proms with a full symphony orchestra, it would sound slightly wrong because it would be too good. I thought I was going to do it originally with a really, really shitty orchestra, just a really bad one.
Yeah.
But I think it's much better. I think one thing I learned from doing Zoolander was that you can't let people know through music that it's supposed to be funny. I think the worst thing you can do is try and write funny music. I think you have to take it absolutely seriously. So that was taking the idea of the Britain that these people live in absolutely seriously, and let's give them an absolutely serious, proper national anthem for it. But in the execution of it, we should make it a bit more like the characters, which are not quite up to par, perhaps.
What do you enjoy about composing for TV?
I like the fact that you're not having to do conference calls with Hollywood studios with 25 or 30 people on. It's terrifying, that sort of stuff. I like the fact that most of the time I'm working with people that I like. I'm working on shows that I kind of like. People seem to be a bit happy that you're doing it for them.
What if you don't like the show? You said kind of like
I wouldn't do it. Yeah, I wouldn't do it. That'd be horrible, wouldn't it? I mean, imagine if you had someone, if you thought of a TV show and you'd hired someone to write something for it and you knew that they didn't really like it, it would be awful. No, you have to like it. Yeah.
How can you mentioned?
I had to like Godzilla. I did that.
Deeper Underground. I like the soundtrack.
Yeah, that was
all
right.
Was great. You mentioned
still a bloke in a suit though. It's like this whole thing about like.
Shh, don't spoil the illusion. You mentioned producers earlier as well about, within TV, those are the ones that are calling the shots. How can they make your life easier? How can producers make your life easier you know, whether it's bringing you on board earlier on, paying you?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of them would like, you know, to have more budget available for music, because I think once you get to the point when you're putting music on a show, you realise actually how important it is and how much you need. And there's some amazing TV music has been composed over the years, you know, and you know you get compilation albums of it. You know, there's just some amazing music being written for TV, and well, how can they make it easier? I think perhaps, you know, an understanding of I think with digital editing, it's been very, very easy to try things out just by doing that. You know, it's like, we'll try that in that space, and try that in that space. And, you know, it seems a bit odd being nostalgic about olden times now. You know, I mean, I'm not ancient, but you know, when I was starting, it was like everything was on tape or film, and so any editing I had to do was a physical thing that had to happen. You know, they'd run it through the steam back, they'd chop it, they'd marry the two sides up, and then they'd run it again. You know, and it would take a couple of minutes, you know, to see an edit. Whereas now it's like, you know, you can take whole chunks of the thing and rearrange it digitally within a matter of minutes. And sometimes there's an expectation that music is produced in the same way. And I think the danger is, and we might be steering some way towards that at the moment, is that if you make your programs like that, the music has got no choice other than to try and follow suit. And that will mean that everything is kind of cut and pasted, you know, and everything tends to be sort of sequential, and it all sounds a little bit like a demo from a new synthesizer.
Yeah.
You know? Everything goes bang, you know, and that's
Calvin Harris's
repertoire. And that's your theme tune, you know. And it's like, I like writing tunes, you know, like I like writing something which hopefully adds something to the drum. Not that everyone doesn't want to do this, but it's something which can exist on its own as well. And it's a tune, you know, you can play it and you think that's what our show is about. And so it's difficult when you know, if you get a lot of kind of picture changes and everything, that there's an expectation that music can be changed as quickly as that. Sometimes it can, and sometimes it can't. You know, it's a bit like if you have a line of dialogue. If you have a line, you know, to be or not to be, right? We think it's not long. You know, we need to have it longer. Now, there's only two ways that can happen. You know, you either say it slower, or you know, you have to add more words to it. In which case, it's different. It's not just a matter of saying we need this to be longer or shorter. So, you know, a lot of the time, you know, with music, it sort of has an internal rhythm anyway, and I guess, you know, yeah, be nice to us and don't tell us to get out of the way when someone from Hollyoaks has turned up.
Do you think music is being used more as a, you know, in productions, almost like as a marketing tool as well, more so now?
I'm not so sure. I mean, I think people tend to be surprised when music happens away from the show. I mean, Doctor Who's been a thing where, you know, that music has appeared in pop records, and, you know, the soundtrack albums for the new Doctor Who, you know, sell a lot. You know, Murray is like an amazing composer, and, you know, he's done an amazing thing with that, where the music has actually been a huge part of what the new show is, and very distinctive. But I'm not sure anyone expected that to happen. You know, I mean, to a certain extent, Sherlock's been a bit like that with the music. That it's, you know, it seems to have kind of caught on a bit. There is an online Sherlock orchestra where all these people from around the world who play an instrument play a part, and someone edits it all together, and there's like 300 different people all playing stuff from Sherlock, which is incredible. But, you know, the music in that show's got a chance to sort of shine a little bit, you know, because it's a 90-minute thing, so there's usually a point where like music will come up, and it's got a title sequence, and title sequences are always great. You know, I love the idea of a title sequence where you're establishing what the show is, and you're kind of saying, this is the world that we're creating, you know, like, come into this and get people interested in it. But anyway, so on the back of that, then I think you can. But when you're from a standing start, I think it's difficult to get music to really promote anything on TV. You know, I found that the only way to really promote anything on TV is for it to be on TV in the first place. And the great power of the BBC is that, you know, if they're launching a new show, then it's inescapable. You know, not as it only on BBC One, BBC Two, 3 and 4. They'll plug it on radio as well. You know, so that network is so all-powerful in a way in terms of promotion. That's true of things like Children in Need as well. You know, if you're doing a charitable thing, it's almost impossible to compete with the power of the BBC and the Children in Need campaign, because I do stuff with other charities, and it's like it's you know, it's difficult to do that, but well, it's interesting.
I'm afraid we've run out of time, but before we completely finish, we've got a little bit of a treat, since we have David here, and it's the final session as well for the festival.
Free drink.
And we're going to hear something from Sherlock. Explain to us what we're going to hear and who you've brought today.
Well, we thought we'd play a couple of themes from Sherlock. Obviously, we haven't got an orchestra, but we've got some amazing players who are going to come up. We're going to do it slightly, well, I'd say slightly gypsy-ish.
It's great.
I'm not sure if you're allowed to say that anymore. But yeah.
Has, just while they're getting themselves set, with Sherlock, something you continue to work on, does the pressure increase as the success of the show increases?
I think the doing of it gets a bit easier because, to a certain extent, you've already established what the music is. So we're 2/3 of the way through the new series now. I'm going recording the next one on Tuesday. So that'll be episodes 1 and 2 done, and episode 3 they're shooting at the moment. I think the real thing is that you try and find something new to do every time. You know, Sherlock as a show, I think it feels like it needs to be moving on all the time. If you feel like you're sort of sitting back and just repeating yourself, I think it will just stagnate. So we're trying to find new ways of doing things, and I think we've definitely done it in 1. You know, the how did he do it stuff, and in 2, there's some, I think, some terrific new things as well. So I just hope, I hope it continues to, you know, kind of satisfy an audience, because I think it set a high standard in terms of the state of TV.
Yeah.
And I know when Mark showed me the first one like 5 odd years ago, I just said, I think it's the best bit of TV I've seen like for 4 or 5 years. I just thought it was incredible. And Benedict I'd known for years. I did a film with him called Amazing Grace, and he was always my favourite actor. And I always said it as well when people asked me what my favourite British actor was. So it's fantastic seeing it, and all of a sudden just creating a Sherlock Holmes that wasn't the way that you would expect him to be, you know. And Martin is just, I think it's brilliant casting and brilliant writing, and I hope people will be as excited as this new one as I am, but it's some brilliant stuff. But anyway,
and we'll brilliant music as well.
And also, Eos here is whenever you hear Benedict playing the violin in the show, that's who you're hearing. And she also has the dubious pleasure of having to teach Benedict in his house how to play it, which is a terrible thing to have to do. So we're going to do a couple of things from Sherlock. Thank you very much for coming. This isn't a Q&A, is it?
This is it.
We didn't do a Q&A.
This is it. This is us playing out.
This is our big end.
Thanks everyone for coming. David
Okay,
Arnold.
light Darcy Bustle, set her on fire, and let's go.
everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Edith. Thank you.
Safe journey home, everybody.